Here is Sailor Studio 241. The swatch certainly looks like a decent mid-tone kind of blue, but the writing sample shows it to be a lighter turquoise ink, very evident in the chromatography. There is almost no tone shift as papers change. Toned papers kind of excluding here. We'll see that later. And it does shade rather nicely, and it does it consistently. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, this has no issue with feathering, except copy paper, of course. But it's manageable there, so it's not going to be the end of the world. Now, this is a perfectly good ink that is easy to read on the page, but the color is just not up my, I don't care about it. That's where it tends to fall. Turquoise just isn't for me. So it's dead to me there. Sounds horrible. It's not an ink that I'm going to say I'm going for it. But I do think that this is a great ink. And if you like turquoise, you really should be looking at this.
The pen for today is a Platinum 3776. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we can clearly see how this is a nice mid-tone of turquoise, as it has no feathering, no spread, great shading throughout all of it. It just really back and forth. Look at the unraveled on the first line, where the UN work from lighter towards darker through the R. The A gets a bit darker still. The V works from darker to lighter. E, nice and light. Lead at the end starts getting dark again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Kobe number 30. Here is Sailor Kobe number 8. Here is Sailor Kobe number 6 Bordeaux. Here is Sailor Soleil.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that we have just about the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Does not feather, does not spread, barely shades on this paper. This is not fountain pen friendly paper in how it's made, so that's not in itself a problem. But it does shade, just not huge. I mean, look at R still on the second line, where the AR is lighter than the E at the end. Still, through certain letters, has darker and lighter parts, but the ST is noticeably lighter than the IL at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is definitely lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Also, definitely a little bit more green leaning. Now, doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Gives a very gentle look to it. Now, that slight green lean that we're getting is a result of the toned paper, meaning that this ink is just a little bit more translucent. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. The problem that we're facing here is about how well does it stand out against the quad rule. And this particular tone, it's probably one of the reasons I really don't go for turquoise too much, is it really is with the quad rule. I see both at the same time, all the time. Neither has a dominant presence. This puts me in a position of not really wanting to use this ink on this type of paper. and doing so much math, I use this type of paper very frequently. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more teal or turquoise inks.
Here is Diamine Aqua Lagoon. Here is Organic Studios Nickel Teal. Here is Robert Oster Turquoise. Here is Thornton's Turquoise.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
We can see here that the tone certainly is lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. This is not a great ink for students to use in this case. Look at how it blends with those lines. It is just, I think, too light for a student use in their note-taking or in a lab notebook. But maybe it could work as a secondary color just to add to what's going on if you had a much darker color as your main. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Waterman Radiant Pink. Here is Mont Blanc Lucky Orange. Here is Private Reserve Burgundy Mist. Here is Pilot 100th Anniversary Yellow.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does have some tiny feathers, not really worth a whole lot of attention because it does not detract from the writing. I think this could do very well if this is the paper that you frequently write on. I know we've come across that a lot in the Sailor Studios series. It has a faint amount of spread, not something that would stop you from using this. And it still does shade. I think it is dark enough to use on this paper as it is that you can see it with no problem. Looking at the back of the page, no ghosting, no bleeding, no problem using this here. This really steps up this ink on this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Platinum 3776 Broad is a dry nib that gives decent shading and a good enough tone. Now, off camera, I tried it in a very wet medium, and it kept the shading and did darken up just a little bit, but it was darkened to more of a color that I don't want. Now, while this is more of a color not for me, I do think it's a nicer and more interesting version of many turquoise inks. If you're a turquoise ink lover, I think this is a really good one to go with. So I must recommend a wet medium or a wet fine for this ink.